Hi, I'm Dawn Cavanaugh, APQS Education Director. I love how fast and easy it is to get quilts done on a long arm, and my APQS machine with its simple controls makes that super easy and fast. And the quilt path system even helps more with accuracy and design placement. It makes me look like a much better quilter since it can be absolutely perfect. Well, one of the things that I'm still not great at and not perfect at is my procrastination problem. I tend to put things off a little bit too long, and then when I'm up against a deadline, I find that I've got to rush to get things done. Well, when I found out a good friend's baby was going to be here soon, I needed to get a quilt done very quickly. So I've got the quilt quilted. It's ready to go, but I'm going to show you a trick about how to speed up the finishing process. Now, you might want to learn a little bit more about attaching the binding right on your long arm frame. We've got a YouTube video. Check out our APQS quilting channel to learn how to do that. With that process, however, the binding gets attached to the quilt while it's still on the frame, and it's sewn on all the way around. But that still leaves the hand sewing after you've taken it off the frame, or machine stitching using a regular domestic sewing machine. With this next process I'm going to show you, we're going to completely attach the binding by machine. It's going to make a very nice finish on the front of the quilt and get it done a lot faster than if I would sit and stitch it by hand. Even though that's one of my favorite things to do on a cold winter's night, is sit there with my quilt over my lap, stitching the binding down, watching my favorite show. So the quilt is done. It's going to come off the frame. We're going to move to my sewing machine and we'll get started. So lots of people actually use the sewing machine to attach their binding to the quilt, but we typically sew it down on one side and then hand stitch it on the other side. With this trick, we're going to use the machine to do the whole process, but in a little bit different way than you might be used to. We're going to sew the binding to the back of the quilt first and then wrap it around to the front. To make that process really easy and simple, especially using the sewing machine, I'm going to use a product that I like a lot to make the fabric nice and crisp, because I'm going to actually press that binding around the quilt and up to the front. One product that works great for me is this Mary Ellen's Best Press. It's similar to a spray starch, and spray starch would work great for you too. This is nice and easy, and it smells good too. So when we get to that step, I'll show you how to do that. Of course, you're also going to need your normal rotary cutting ruler, your rotary cutting mat, and of course a rotary cutter. And it helps to have a square rotary cutter ruler so that you can trim the corners of the quilt down. So the first step we're going to need to do is to measure the quilt to know how long we need to cut our binding. I'm going to measure my quilt now and give it about 15 extra inches or so for an overlap. Personally, I'd rather be a little bit too generous than get all the way around the quilt and find out that I'm a little bit too short. So I've got the quilt laid out. I'm going to change positions here and show you how I'm going to measure it, and then we'll get the binding strips cut. Well, in theory, my quilt should be pretty square, but I always like to double check just to make sure. So let's see. Side number 1 is 40 inches. Give it a quick spin. And 40. So let's do our quick math to see how many actual strips we need. We have 40 inches a side times 4 sides. That's 160 inches. I'm going to add another 15 inches or so. So that gives me 175 inches that I'm looking for. If I assume that each of my strips is 40 inches long when I cut them, I know that I'm going to need, of course, if you do 175 divided by 40, looks like we're going to need about 4, that's 16, bring down the 1. I'm going to need definitely 4 plus strips, so really 5 strips cut for my binding. Since I finished this quilt on the long arm, it did have stay stitching along the outer edges, but that's not necessarily where I'm going to trim. Since I do have piecing that ends out here at the edge of the quilt rather than a border, I'm going to trim the quilt so that I have that 1/4 inch margin, just like you would if you were attaching the binding on the front. Of course, you can cut your binding wider and use different sizes, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But I'm going to use this large square. I really love it. It's actually a 20.5 inch rotary cutting square, so it allows me to get right up next to my seam allowances here and scoot that in and actually then check to see how I'm coming around the corners. I can adjust the quilt and then do my trimming, and we're ready to roll. I grabbed my narrower ruler since my other ruler isn't quite enough to reach, just to get myself a little bit farther. Then I'm going to spin the quilt the rest of the way and grab that square cutting ruler again. I'm going to finish this up and then we'll talk about the binding widths. Keep in mind, I'm just showing you one way to accomplish this task. What you do in terms of the binding width or whether you trim your batting before or afterwards does depend a lot on how much of that binding you want to wrap around to the front. Since my quilt has piecing on the front, I don't want my binding to wrap around so far that it's actually covering up the outer piece corners and things where my patchwork meets. So let's take a look at some of the options. I've got just some small samples here for you to take a look at, so you can have an idea of what things would look like with different binding widths. This binding is a little narrower than the one you see on this side. This binding was cut to 2 1/4 inches wide and then folded in half, of course, and then sewn down. Notice that it's a little more generous than 1/4 inch. This binding, on the other hand, was 2 1/2 inches wide when the strip was cut and then folded in half and then pressed. It depends on which one you like in terms of the binding finish, along with how much of that's going to wrap to the front. Remember, this is the front of your quilt, not the back. Well, I've got some decorative stitches also holding that down, which means we need to pay attention to the back of the quilt too. We're going to flip this over and see what the stitching looks like. Notice that I used a matching thread on the top. When I flip this over, I also used matching thread in the bobbin. So since this was a little bit closer in terms of its size in the wrap both front and back, and I'm not exactly perfect, you can see a little bit of that thread showing here. But obviously on this wrap, where that fine stitching was in place, we see the entire length of bobbin stitching. Well, let's flip to this sample. Take a look at some different ways to attack that stitching. Both of these were now cut to that 2 1/4 inches, so not quite as wide as that first sample. The one on this side is using a straight stitch to secure it all the way down. Of course, this is still that blanket stitch that you see. In this example, both of them still have the red bobbin thread, so it's still noticeable on the back side. Just depends on how much time you want to take and how careful you want to be, or if that even bothers you in the first place. If this was a busy back instead of this white fabric, I wouldn't mind that a bit because it wouldn't show. Well, third, let's take a look at what will happen if we match our top thread to the binding and the back thread to the back of the quilt. Now in this case, I still have that blanket stitch on this side, but on the opposite side, I've actually got two different styles of stitching for you. I started with a straight stitch right here. Let me use this to help point that out. Then, to show you a little bit of variety, I switched to a very narrow zigzag. One of the things I like about a narrow zigzag for my binding security is that it actually gives that binding just a little bit of stretch and flexibility, especially if that quilt's going to be tugged and played with a lot. The straight stitch gives it a lot of stability. So stretchability, stability. Let's take a look at the back now. On this side, you can see what it would look like with that dark thread. But take a look at the opposite side. I used white matching thread. Here you can see the zigzag, but you don't see it at all. And here's that straight stitch once again. In all of these examples, I'm using a traditional cotton weight type of batting. If you're using something thicker, like a wool or polyester, your measurements are going to change. That will also impact how much is going to wrap around to the back of the, from the back of the quilt around to the front. So it's always a good idea to do a little bit of a practice or experimentation with some of your extra pieces that you may have trimmed off first to make sure that you like the amount that's wrapping around. And also experiment with the tension settings on your sewing machine so that if you want to use two different colors of thread, you do the best job you can to balance those top and bobbin stitches. Well, I know that I want my strips to be 2 1/4 inch wide. Now, while I could take my cutting ruler and line it up with that 2 1/4 inch line and continue to move it the entire way, here's a more efficient way to do that to make it faster, but also to help keep your fabric level. I've got an 8-inch ruler, actually an 8 1/2 inch ruler. I'm going to see how many cuts I can actually get without having to slide the ruler on top of the new piece of fabric. So I know that I can get one at 2.25, which is 2 1/4. Another cut of a 2 1/4 inch would make me at 4.5. That's 2 strips. And another 2 1/4 inch strip would put me at 6.75 inches. These are all inches. So I'm going to start with the largest one and then work my way back. When I do this, it'll probably make a little more sense. Set that out of the way. I'll line up the line on my cutting ruler on the 6, right here, the 6 3/4 inch mark all the way down, and lining it up along the bottom, and take my first cut. Of course, practice good rotary cutting habits and walk that hand down the ruler, keeping it across from where your rotary cutter is. Well, now look how easy this is. Just slide that over until my 4 1/2 inch mark is aligned with the edge of the fabric under the ruler. And I'll make another slice. And one more time to my last one, my 2 1/4 inch mark. Slide that over until I'm at my 2 1/4. There and there. And we cut. Look at that, we've got 3 strips, lickety split. We've got 2 more to cut. Do the same thing. This time I only need 2, so I'll jump up to my 4 1/2 inch mark. Line the ruler up at 4 1/2. I'll double check to make sure my edge is still square by checking across the bottom. Looks like we are. So we'll make 1 cut. And then scoot that ruler one more time to the smallest measurement, that 2 1/4. Oop, a little bump there. And our last cut for our 5th strip. There we go. 5 binding strips will now move to the front, and I'll show you a quick trick on how to sew those together quickly. Now that I've got my binding strips all cut, it's time to put them together. I'm going to use a mitered corner. Well, the light's a little bit better over here. I want to show you a trick I'm going to do with painter's tape in front of my sewing machine, but my goal is to overlap these 2 pieces of binding with their right sides together. I'm not even going to take the time to trim off those salvages. I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of that extra. But I'm going to put these at a right angle to each other and see if I can line that up on this cutting mat to show you. Take a look at that line that's actually traveling right through to the opposite corner here. Well, over on my sewing table, I put a piece of painter's tape exactly in line with the needle. So as I'm sewing, I'm going to allow this corner where this intersection happens for my binding to slide right along the painter's tape right through the sewing machine, so I don't have to do anything. Well, I've got the edge of my painter's tape on my table right here exactly in line with the needle, and I've got a 1/4 inch foot attached to my sewing machine along with matching thread. So I'm going to overlap just as you saw me do it just a moment ago. And let's get this underneath my needle right there in that top intersection. And I've got the bottom right in line with this piece of painter's tape. So we're going to sew those together. Just let your machine do the work and guide that along the way. When I reach the end, I'm going to grab the opposite end of this particular strip that was on top, I'm going to flip it over so that it's now right side up, and grab a new binding strip and put it face down right over the top of that one. And I'm going to chain these together just exactly the same way. I'll get that started and then line it up with my painter's tape. After that, we'll just need to press it in half along the entire length with the wrong sides facing each other. Well, I'm going to trim these off. I'm just eyeballing my 1/4 inch. You can tell I'm not quite as particular as some people might be. It's okay if you want to get out your rotary cutter and trim those precisely, but I'm okay with just a good old eyeball. Trimming each one of those and that little extra extension right off. I'll head to my ironing board and press those seams open, and then along the entire length we will press these right sides together and we'll pick up putting it on with the quilt. Well, I've got the binding all pressed. You can see that here where we did the joining, the seam was pressed open. I do want to make sure, if I can help it, to avoid having this bulky seam actually fall at one of the corners of the quilt. That can make it really tough to get nice crisp corners. Well, I know that my quilt was 40 inches square and my strips are about 40 inches, so I should be able to start with that little corner about halfway down or away from this edge on this quilt. So I've got the quilt with the backing or wrong side facing up. I'm going to leave a tail of about 8 inches or so, so that I'm going to be able to join it when I come back around. So I'm going to start by sewing all the way along here, lining the raw edges of the quilt and the batting and the backing together, the whole quilt sandwich. When I get down to the corner, I'm going to stop a 1/4 inch away, just like you would if you were attaching it to the front. My presser foot happens to have a 1/4 inch mark on it, so I'm okay eyeballing and then stopping when I'm a 1/4 inch away from this approaching edge. But if you don't have that, or you're not quite sure, before you get all the way to the edge, you can go ahead and use a ruler and mark. I haven't sewn it, of course, but mark with something like a chalk marker to know exactly where you're supposed to stop before you continue on and fold the corner. Let's get this started, and we'll refocus the camera so you can see what I'm doing from my perspective. Now, of course, if you need to or feel more comfortable to, you can certainly pin your binding onto your quilt fabric. I'm just going to go for it. Now remember, I want to stop before I reach this edge. I want to be 1/4 of an inch back from this spot. So remember, if you need to mark that, you can get out your ruler, give yourself a mark. And that's going to be, I'll do that for the camera anyway. It's going to be right here. I'm going to stop. One more. And there we go. Then I push on my reverse button and back myself up. So I stopped a 1/4 of an inch away from the approaching raw edge of the quilt. And just like when you attach binding the traditional way, I'm going to fold it up so that it makes a nice 45-degree angle from the corner of the quilt all the way up, and your raw edge is in a nice straight line down the next edge of the quilt. Then we're going to fold it back down. Got all that extra binding there with me. Making sure that the folded edge is in line with the edge we just finished, and the new edge is following along the next side that we're going to complete. We're going to rotate the quilt, but we'll start sewing right here at the fold and continue all the way down. See if I can get my thread tails where they belong. And spin this quilt around, get the bulk on my lap, and we'll get started again. So dropping that down with the edge of the binding and the edge of the quilt, even with the edge of my foot. Well, as you can see, I'm approaching the beginning tail that I left hanging at the very start of attaching the binding. So I'm going to stop where I've got these overlapping by a good, generous 5 or 6 inches. I want to make sure that I'll have plenty of room to actually miter them together. So I'm going to sew a little bit farther. I want to leave plenty of room. I'll do a little back stitch. And let's clip those threads. Okay, here's a really slick trick that's worked for me for attaching my binding and joining these in a miter. Remember that I cut this binding 2 1/4 inches wide. This trick works if I've cut my binding to 2 1/2 or 2 3/4, whatever width it is. I'm going to grab my ruler again. I've actually got just a little bit extra here that I really don't need. I'm going to cut some of that tail off now. You can see I've got quite a bit of beginning and ending tail. Still have just a little bit too much. Okay. Here's the trick. We want to overlap our beginning and our ending by the same amount that we cut the width of the binding. So if I've cut it by 2 1/4 inch when it was open, I want to overlap these by 2 1/4 inch. So I'm using my ruler, lining it up with the piece that's underneath, coming down, finding my 2 1/4 inch mark, and I'm going to mark the top piece right here. And now I'm going to cut that off at a nice straight edge. So I'll take one more look. They're overlapped. That might be confusing you. Let's get that out of the way. And I'll move it just a little bit so you can see. There's that 2 1/4 inch mark. So now what we're going to do is open these up and turn them at a 45-degree angle and sew them together. It's going to take some finagling. Sometimes I have to even unsew a little bit if I've gone too far, and I might have actually gone a little bit too far on this one. One way to do this, of course, is to tuck these inside of each other, folding this over, and then slipping it inside, but I personally prefer a little bit tidier ending. So I've got the two pieces together. I'm going to open them up. You can see here. I'm going to put one of them, there we go, it's fighting me. One of them with the right side facing up. The other one I'm going to open up and twist it so the right side is facing down. Just like this. See if I can get that bulk out of the way. Well, now you might want to use a few pins to help keep things in line since you're fighting the bulk of the quilt along with everything else. So I'm making sure that I've got one corner aligned. I'm going to put a pin in there to hold it while I twist the bottom around. And see if I can fumble around here and get it twisted. There's the opposite corner. Stick a pin in there, hold those in place. That bulk just does not want to play nicely with me. I just might have to open up a little bit of that seam to make it better. In fact, let's do that. As you sow, so shall ye rip. I'm going to take out a few of those ending stitches, and I can use that seam ripper to pop that loose and give me a little bit more flexibility. Let's pick those little stray threads out of there. Much better, much better. Now you can see what we're doing. We're overlapping those two pieces. We're going to sew them from outside corner to outside corner. Make sure you're sewing them in the right direction so when they open up it's correct. It's easy to sometimes make a mistake and sew it this way, and it's certainly not going to work. It's going to end up being a nice little T. So here we go. We'll sew this and check our fit before we trim it. I've lined up the edge, taken a few stitches, and using that same painter's tape, that trick we did before, to make sure that the top and the bottom are lined up and sliding along the tape. Pull that pin out when I get there. That pin out of there. And hit the corner. Well, let's move that over and check our fit. You can just finger press to get it started and see how things are going. It's better to check first and then trim later. But take a look. Look at how nice and neat that's going to be once we've got it trimmed and pressed. I want to reduce the bulk when I make these corners to make them nice and tidy. So this trick will do that. This is the quilt top now. You can see I've got the top in front of me. I'm going to peel the corner of the quilt top to reveal the binding. There's a little fold right here where that miter was created when I made the turn. I'm going to use my scissors and actually go into that fold, get it in there, into that little V shape and snip. I've actually created a little triangle shape now. I'm going to remove that little triangle shape with the scissors to reduce the bulk. Oop, there it went. Of course, with a little tinier scissors, you could get in there a little bit better. That's going to make it easier for me to turn the corner and make the miter lay nice and flat. I'm going to do that to all four corners, and then we'll show you how to use the Mary Ellen's Best Press to fold the quilt binding around to the front and make it nice and easy to attach. Move the ironing board over so that you can see what's going on. I happen to be using a wool press pad that helps a lot with that steam to really set this, especially since I want a nice crisp edge when I'm doing that. So we've got the right side of the quilt down and the binding sewed to the wrong side. Now I'm going to use that Mary Ellen's Best Press or your spray starch to spray and then press all of this binding nice and firmly away from the quilt. I'm also going to make sure that I pay attention to the corners. I personally do use steam. It's going to help make sure that it's nice and crisp. I'll work the iron into the tip right there. We're going to continue working our way all the way around the quilt. Well, we've got the top of the quilt now flipped over. I'm going to spin this around so the camera gets a little better angle here to talk about this corner that we're going to sew now. When I sewed down this side and brought it in, as opposed to this side, you're going to see that you have two choices in which way to overlap this corner. One direction is going to give you a lot less bulk than the other. If I'm sewing this direction, the way I sewed it on in the first place, and then flip this over, I got a little bigger lump here in the corner. So I'm going to sew with the coming edge down underneath this edge. I'm going to come down, stop, and then make a turn. So I'll just fold it a little bit better so you can see what a great miter that's going to be. We'll futz with it a little bit more underneath the foot, the presser foot. Now that we've got it folded, I am going to go one more time around with that Mary Ellen's Best Press and actually crease this binding over to the top front side of the quilt. I'm going to bring this around to the front and use that spray starch again to help give it a nice crisp edge. Oh, looks like I might have been able to cut this binding just a little bit narrower too. I am going to overlap the edges a little bit. Of course, I could choose to stop here, but that's going to leave some of my binding empty. That's actually not a good thing. That means it'll wear a little bit more. So I'm going to overlap it a little more, and this time, learn my lesson, I'm going to cut off a few of my points, but I could have cut my binding even a little narrower than that 2 1/4 in this instance. So another squirt of that best press, and a fold, and a press with our iron. I'm going to do that all the way around. I'm going to use that iron to get a good crisp press here, lining up my miters to make that nice and neat. I've been working with my clear 1/4 inch foot, but I'm going to switch to an open toe embroidery style foot on my machine because I'm going to use a decorative stitch, actually that zigzag stitch, to stitch the binding down. Now you can use any of your decorative stitches. You've got a sewing machine full of different designs that you'd never use. This is a great way to experiment and have fun with those. I'm going to work to make sure that my zig and my zag fall just on and off the actual edge of the binding fabric. We'll get on the white here and you'll see it a little bit better. You want to for sure get to the first corner so that you can see how we'll capture that as we turn the corner. Now remember that we pressed them so that, let me get a little closer here, 1 second. There we go. So when I pressed it to the front, I pressed it so that the edge I'm coming to is actually underneath the edge I'm sewing. That makes the corner much flatter, but also makes it easier to turn the corner because I don't have to try and negotiate those underneath. So I'm going to stitch until I just get one of my zigs or zags to fall onto the next edge that's coming. Take our time. If you need to use a stylus or perhaps an awl, you can do that. There, I've got the first stitch onto the next binding section. I'm going to leave the needle down, raise the foot, and swing the bulk of that this direction. So look how nice and neat that's laying as we go. Just drop your foot down. Check to make sure that the zig or the zag is going to fall on the right direction. Here I need to scoot it over a little bit so that my right side of the zig will land on the binding and the left side will land just off the edge. And we're going to continue our way all the way around. I'll keep going and we'll show you the quilt when I'm done. Well, the binding is all done on the front, and to see if I can flip it over and take a look at the nice neat job on the back with that white thread. You can see that the stitching, the zigzag, is just on the outside of the binding. Had I cut my binding a little bit narrower, that would have been even closer. But you know what? I'm okay, and I don't think Jameson will mind one single bit. He should wear his daddy's number 21 real proud. So, the last step before giving this new quilt to young Jameson is to use a needle and thread some blue thread. And I'm actually going to sew the fold that's on the front and the back of each miter with a couple of stitches. That'll give a real professional look and really finish off the quilt. So sewing on the binding completely by machine, you see, is really not all that hard. Just take your time to practice a little bit to decide how wide you want to cut it. As you saw, I should have trimmed off a little bit extra. If you practice that, you're going to find that your quilts are going to get done really fast, and they're also really, really durable this way. I still miss that hand stitching, but I'll save that for a cold winter's night when I've got some nice handwork to do. Thanks for watching. Feel free to visit our APQS YouTube channel for more inspirational videos and tips. Like us on Facebook and visit our website at apqs.com.